There was a text message. 11 words. I've read it maybe 200 times since then. Not because I didn't understand it the first time, but because a man over 60 does strange things with his hands when his chest can't quite sort out what it's feeling. 11 words from my son-in-law Craig Beausoleil. Sent at 11:47 on a Tuesday night while I was in the basement refinishing a chair I'd been meaning to get to for years. Norm, this arrangement isn't sustainable. You need to find your own place. That was it. No period at the end. Like he couldn't even be bothered to finish the sentence. I was standing under the fluorescent light in the basement of the house I'd owned since 1994. The same house where my son had learned to walk. Where my wife had kept a garden every summer until she couldn't anymore. Where I'd spent 31 years paying down a mortgage one bi-weekly payment at a time. I read the message twice. Then I set my phone face down on the workbench and stood very still for a moment. And then very quietly I started to smile. Let me go back because none of this makes sense without the years that came before it. My name is Norman Aldridge. I'm 64 years old. I spent my career as a certified land surveyor working across northern Ontario and parts of Manitoba. Mostly for resource companies and municipal governments who needed to know exactly where things stood. I was good at my work because I am, at my core, a precise man. I measure things. I document them. I keep records. It took me a long time to understand that this habit would be the thing that saved me. My son is Kieran. He's 32 now. Grew up in our house in Sudbury, played hockey until he was 17, then lost interest and pivoted to computers, which turned out to suit him better than anyone expected. He got a diploma in IT systems from the college here, found decent work maintaining networks for a logistics company, and by his late 20s he seemed to be building something solid. I was proud of him. I still am, in the parts of me that aren't something else. He met Craig Beausoleil at a company hockey league 3 years ago. Craig worked in procurement at the same firm, a few years older than Kieran. Big laugh, firm handshake. The kind of man who makes a strong first impression, and then, if you're watching carefully, never quite improves on it. They got serious fast. Kieran moved into Craig's apartment across town, and for a while that seemed to be going well. My wife Elise passed in the spring of 2022. Pancreatic cancer. We had 8 weeks from the diagnosis to the end, which is not enough time to prepare for anything, but is somehow also too much time to simply not think about what's coming. We were together for 38 years. I won't say more than that because some things don't need to be explained to the right audience, and if you're here, you already know what that kind of loss feels like in the first months. The house in Sudbury went from being a home to being a museum of someone who wasn't there anymore. Kieran came around a lot that first year. So did Craig, actually. In those early months, Craig was attentive, helpful, the kind of son-in-law you feel guilty for ever having doubted. He fixed the downspout on the eaves. He drove me to 2 of Elise's estate appointments when I didn't trust myself behind the wheel. I told myself I'd been too hasty in my quiet reservations about him. I told myself grief was making me suspicious of things that didn't deserve suspicion. About 8 months after Elise passed, Kieran called me on a Sunday afternoon. His voice had that particular tension I recognized from when he was a teenager and needed something saying he wasn't sure I'd give him. He and Craig were having trouble. The building they rented had been sold, new owner was coming in with major renovations. They had 60 days to find somewhere else. The rental market in Sudbury that year was brutal. Vacancy rates under 2%. Nothing decent available that they could afford quickly. Could they stay with me? Just until they got back on their feet. 3 or 4 months at most. I said yes while he was still framing the question. And I want to be honest with you about why. Because I think people assume the worst about the decisions that come before the disaster. As if the person who gets taken advantage of must have been naive, or weak, or foolish. I wasn't any of those things. I was a father whose son needed help, and I had 3 unused bedrooms, and saying no didn't enter my mind as a real option. I would have done it again. That part I don't regret. What I didn't know was what 3 or 4 months meant to Craig Beausoleil. The first few months were actually fine. Better than fine sometimes. There was noise in the house again. Someone in the kitchen in the morning. A light on when I came home from the hardware store. I let myself believe it was doing us all some good. Kieran and I talked more than we had in years. We watched the playoffs together. I taught him how to properly use a hand plane on the furniture projects I'd been neglecting. There were weeks that felt almost like something I recognized. Then, slowly, things began to shift. It's never one thing. That's the part no one warns you about. It's never a single moment you can point to and say, that's where it started. It's an accumulation. A chair moved without asking. A new set of rules about the kitchen appearing as suggestions and gradually becoming expectations. Craig started referring to the house as our place. In conversation with his friends, I heard it twice on phone calls he took in the living room without lowering his voice. He rearranged the pantry and put Elise's canning jars in a recycling bag by the back door. I found them there on a Thursday evening and stood holding one of them for a long moment before I put it back on the shelf. I didn't say anything. This is what I'm most ashamed of, looking back. Not the silence itself, but what I told myself the silence was. I called it patience. I called it love. I called it not wanting to make things harder for Kieran. What it actually was, I understand now, is that I had confused being a good father with making myself disappear. By the second year, Craig had stopped looking for a place. Not stopped trying, stopped looking. There was always a reason. This one had too much noise from the highway. That one didn't allow them to have Craig's brother's dog on weekends. Another one fell through because of the first and last deposit. I'm a surveyor. I document things. I started keeping a log. Not out of bitterness. I want to be clear about that, but out of the professional instinct that had served me for 35 years. When things don't add up, you measure them until they do. The numbers, when I added them up around the 18-month mark, came out to somewhere around $94,000. Utilities, groceries, the furnace repair that's December, the roof reshingling I pushed up the schedule on partly because Craig had been storing equipment in the attic, and I was worried about the joists. I wasn't bitter. I was just keeping the stress reading the way I would on any structure I was responsible for. What I didn't know was that Craig had a different understanding of what they were doing in my house. Not guests extending a temporary stay. Residents building equity in a place they'd come to think of as theirs. The first sign of it was a comment at dinner one night when Kieran's aunt was visiting. Craig mentioned casually that they'd been thinking about putting a deck off the back of the house, that they'd been pricing materials, not asking me, mentioning it to my sister-in-law as if I were the one who needed to be informed. I said quietly that the backyard had drainage issues I'd been meaning to address first, and Craig said, "Yeah, we should probably sort that out before next summer." That word sat in my chest for a week. The second sign was when I mentioned to Kieran, in private, that I'd been thinking about selling the Sudbury house eventually, maybe moving somewhere smaller now that it was just me. Kieran's face did something complicated. "Craig and I were actually hoping to talk to you about that," he said. "We've been wondering if there was a way to structure something. Maybe buy in, make it more official." I asked what more official meant. He said Craig had looked into it, that with their combined income they might be able to take over the mortgage. Offer me something for the equity. I'm a surveyor. I know what land is worth and I know who holds title to it. The house had been paid off since 2019. There was no mortgage to take over. The equity they wanted to buy into wasn't something Craig had looked into. It was something he had measured and decided he wanted. I said I'd think about it. I went to bed and lay in the dark for a long time thinking about structures. About the way a foundation looks solid from the outside long after the crack has started forming in the middle where no one thinks to look. 3 weeks after that conversation I met someone. Her name is Pauline. She's 62, retired from the school board after 30 years as a special education coordinator. Funny in a way that doesn't announce itself. Completely unafraid of her own opinions. We met at a grief support group I'd been attending since January, which is not the most romantic origin story but is, I've found, a very efficient way to meet people who understand something true about loss. We started with coffee after the Thursday sessions, then walks along the Ramsey Lake path. Then dinner. I told Kieran about her on a Sunday. I kept it simple. Said I'd been seeing someone, that it felt good, that I was happy. He went quiet for a moment in a way that I couldn't read. Then Craig, who had been in the kitchen and had apparently been listening, came into the doorway and leaned against the frame. "Kieran and I have been talking," he said. His voice had a tone in it I hadn't heard before. Careful. Practiced. "We want to make sure you're not rushing into something. You're still processing a lot. This sounds like it could complicate things for everyone." I looked at him. 38 years of marriage had given me a very precise instrument for detecting when someone says one thing and means another. What Craig Beausoleil was telling me was that a woman in my house was a variable he hadn't planned for. I said I appreciated the concern and that I was going to have Pauline over for dinner the following Saturday. Craig's jaw tightened. He said, "I just think we should have a conversation before you start bringing people into our home." Our home. There it was. Said out loud this time, directly to me without even the courtesy of lowering his voice. I picked up my keys from the bowl by the door and said I had some errands to run. I drove to Pauline's apartment across town and told her everything, sitting at her kitchen table while she made tea, and listened the way she'd spent 30 years learning to listen. All the way through, without interrupting. When I finished, she set down the mugs and asked, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. Under that answer, I did know. I just needed a few days to be sure. That night I drove back to the house and went down to the basement. The chair I'd been refinishing was where I'd left it. My phone was face down on the workbench. I picked it up to check the time and saw the notification. A text message from Craig Beausoleil. 11 words. Norm, this arrangement isn't sustainable. You need to find your own place. I read it twice. I set the phone back down. And I stood in the basement of my house and smiled the way I hadn't smiled in years, because something I'd been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting, had finally arrived. Not a conversation I could be talked out of. Not a feeling I could be guilted into ignoring. Evidence. Documented. Time-stamped. Exactly the kind of thing a surveyor knows how to use. I called my solicitor the next morning. Her name is Margaret Chen. We'd worked together on estate matters when a lease passed, and she was already familiar with the property and its history. I left a voicemail at 7:30. She called back at 8:15, which told me everything I needed to know about how she operates. I told her I needed to discuss the legal standing of my current living arrangement, and that some of it was time-sensitive. She said, "Come in at 10. I did. What I need you to understand, because people always assume what came next happened in anger, is that it didn't. The anger was down there somewhere deep under everything, but it wasn't driving. What was driving was something I hadn't let out in 2 years. Self-respect. The quiet, deliberate kind that doesn't need to raise its voice." Margaret listened to everything. She asked precise questions. She wrote things down in her careful, tight handwriting. Then she looked up. "Craig and Kieran have no legal standing in the property," she said. "No contribution to ownership, no written agreement, no lease, no tenancy. Under Ontario law, they're occupants at your invitation. That invitation can be withdrawn." She paused. "Given the duration, we'll need to follow proper notice procedure. 60 days written notice is the standard starting point. If they don't comply, we go to the Landlord and Tenant Board." She said it the way I liked things said, clearly without softening. "Draft the notice," I said. "I want it ready by end of week." She nodded and made a note. Then she looked up again. "You mentioned loan co-signatures. 2 years earlier, Craig had needed a co-signer on a business equipment loan. He'd been running a small side operation buying and flipping used commercial kitchen equipment, one of his big plans, and needed $42,000 in financing. Kieran had asked me on his behalf. I'd said yes, because at the time Craig Beausoleil had seemed like a man building something. The remaining balance was around $28,000. "I want to have my name removed," I said. Margaret looked at me over the rim of her glasses for a moment. "This will create significant pressure on him financially. The lender may call the balance." "I know," I said. "He's your son's partner." I looked at her steadily. "He sent me a text message telling me to find my own place, in my own house. My son didn't call to apologize." She nodded slowly. "Then let's begin." I moved out of the house that same week. Not because I had to. The property was mine, and Margaret had confirmed I had every right to remain. I moved out because every morning I woke up under that roof, I felt something I finally had a precise word for: erased. 2 years of small displacements, of finding my things moved without asking, of watching someone call my home our home, of swallowing the kind of disrespect you tell yourself is too small to confront. I was done waking up in that feeling. I found a furnished short-term rental in the Donovan, a 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor with a window that faced east and good morning light. I brought my tools and my in-progress projects, and the box of Elise's things I kept in the basement. The first night there, I unpacked into a space that was only mine, and for the first time in longer than I could account for, I slept a full night. The notice arrived at the Sudbury house by registered mail on a Friday. Craig signed for it. The courier sent me the confirmation with a timestamp. By Friday evening, I had 6 missed calls from Craig's number and 2 from Kieran. By Saturday morning, 14. I was at Pauline's apartment going through a box of old survey maps I'd been meaning to sort when the 15th came in. I let it ring. "The 16th, I answered. Craig's voice was not what it had been in the text message, less flat, more afraid. "Norm, what the hell is this? What are you doing?" "It's a 60-day notice to vacate," I said, "or to enter into a formal rental agreement at market rate. You can't be serious. You can't just we live there. You can't just send a legal notice without even talking to us." "I sent a solicitor's letter because you sent me a text message," I said. "I thought we were communicating in writing now." Silence. "We have nowhere to go," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that I think was genuine, which made it harder, not easier. "You have 60 days, I said. "That's more than enough time to find a place. I'd start today." I ended the call before he could answer. Kieran called 4 hours later. I let him talk all the way through, which took self-control I hadn't known I still had, because what he said was precise and targeted in the way only your own child can manage. He said I was being vindictive. He said I was punishing him for Craig's message, that Craig had sent it in a moment of frustration and didn't mean it the way it came out. He said I'd never really accepted Craig, and that this was just my way of proving it. And then he said the one I'd been waiting for without realizing it. "Mom would hate this, Dad." She'd be so disappointed in you right now. That landed. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. It went in clean and deep, exactly where he aimed it, and for a moment I sat with it the way you sit with something you know is meant to knock you over. But here's what I knew that Kieran didn't. Elise in her last 2 weeks had said something to me quietly one afternoon when it was just the two of us. And she was having a clear, careful day. She said she'd never been fully at ease about Craig. That she'd seen something in him she couldn't name but recognized. A quality of taking that dressed itself up as charm. She made me promise I'd stay close to Kieran no matter what happened, because she was worried that some of what Kieran had built for himself was built on a foundation he hadn't examined carefully enough. Elise was almost never wrong about people. So when Kieran said his mother would be disappointed in me, I knew with very precise certainty that he was wrong. Kieran, I said when he'd finished, I love you. That has never changed and it will not change. But your partner sent me a text message telling me to find my own place in the house I've owned since before you were in high school. You didn't call me that night to say he was wrong. You didn't call me the next morning to apologize. You called me now 4 days later to tell me I'm the problem. I let that sit for a moment. I hope that changes. The notice stands. I hung up and sat for a long time looking out the window of Pauline's kitchen at the Ramsey Lake path where we walked on Sundays. A chickadee was working over the feeder she'd hung on the railing. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for a long time. The following weeks moved in the particular way difficult time moves, slowly in some hours, fast in others. Pauline kept me steady. Margaret kept me informed. Craig and Kieran, as far as I could tell, spent the first 3 weeks of the 60 days doing very little that was useful. Kieran's cousin messaged me once, not to take sides but to say she was worried about Kieran, and that Craig had apparently told him I'd cave before it came to anything. I noted that with the same neutrality I'd note an adverse condition in a survey report. I wasn't going to cave. On day 27 I drove by the Sudbury house. I needed to retrieve some documents from the filing cabinet I'd left in the office. Survey records, the original title deeds, Elise's estate paper. I called ahead and told Kieran I'd be there for 20 minutes. He answered the door. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping. The house felt different. Not in any way I could measure, but different. It already felt like it didn't belong to me, which was strange because legally every square foot of it still did. What had changed was that I had stopped needing it back. I found my files. On the way to the door, Craig appeared at the top of the stairs. He came down slowly, which I'd never seen him do before. He'd always moved like a man who owned whatever room he was in. He didn't look that way now. We've been looking, he said. Everything decent in the city is over $2,000 a month. First, last, deposit. We don't have that sitting around. I looked at him. I know what rental prices are in this city, Craig. I've been a property owner here for 30 years. I paused. You've got 33 days left. I'd use them. The 60-day period ran out on a Thursday. Margaret filed the application to the Landlord and Tenant Board the following week. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning 6 weeks later. In that time, Craig found a paralegal who specialized in tenancy disputes and filed for a postponement on grounds of hardship. The board granted one additional 2-week extension. I wasn't worried. I had the text message. I had 30 months of records. I had Margaret. The hearing room was smaller than I'd expected, fluorescent lit, the kind of institutional space where important things happen with very little ceremony. Kieran and Craig came in with their paralegal 7 minutes before the session. Kieran in a sweater I'd given him 2 Christmases ago. Craig in a jacket that sat on him the way it sits on men who don't usually wear jackets. They sat across the aisle. Kieran looked at me once. I nodded. He looked away. The adjudicator was a methodical man in his late 50s named Dufresne, who had the expression of someone who had organized this situation into a clear category approximately 45 seconds after reading the file. Margaret laid out our case the way I'd have laid out a property boundary dispute. Deed, 30 years of title continuity, utility accounts, 2 written notices served correctly, and the complete expense record. $94,420, over 26 months, organized in a tabbed binder with monthly breakdowns and receipts. I watched Craig's face when Margaret read that number out loud. Something moved across it. I think it was the first time the cost of what he'd called our home had been stated in a room where he had to sit with it. Their paralegal argued implied tenancy rights, argued disruption to Craig's livelihood, argued that the notice had been issued in retaliation for a private communication. Margaret responded without raising her voice. No written agreement, no financial contribution to ownership. Proper notice procedure followed in full compliance with Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act. And then she said very evenly that if the board wished to review the communication that had preceded the notice, she had it in evidence. She read the text message into the record. 11 words. Norm, this arrangement isn't sustainable. You need to find your own place. Dufresne looked at Craig directly. Is this message accurately transcribed? The room was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system. I could hear a chair shift 2 rows behind me. Craig's paralegal leaned over and said something I couldn't hear. Craig straightened slightly. I sent it in frustration, he said. I didn't mean it as, I wasn't telling him to actually leave. Dufresne looked at him over his glasses. You told the registered owner of the property that the arrangement was unsustainable and that he needed to find his own place. A pause. Your position is that the owner should not have acted on that instruction. Another silence, the kind that has texture. The board finds for the applicant, Dufresne said. The respondents have 30 days to vacate. Owner's rights to the property are confirmed without condition. I heard the sound Kieran made. Quiet, controlled, but I know the sounds my son makes when something inside him rearranges. Craig's face went very still, the way a face goes when there's nothing left to perform. People expect you to feel triumphant at a moment like that. I didn't. I felt what you feel when you've been carrying a structural load for too long and you finally set it down. Just relief. Clean, quiet relief. Outside in the cold March air, Margaret shook my hand and asked what happened next with the property. I'm selling it, I said. I'd decided 2 weeks earlier. Not because I needed the money, though the number would be real and meaningful. I needed to stop living inside a space that held 30 months of being made to feel like a visitor. I wanted to begin in a place that had no history of that. The listing went live that same week. 3-bedroom detached mature lot, Sudbury's South End, priced at $480,000. By day 4 I had 2 offers. I accepted the higher one at $505, conditional on financing 21-day close. A couple in their 40s relocating from Timmins with a teenage daughter, who apparently needed to be closer to her grandparents. They struck me as people who would make good use of the space. The cosigner situation had been moving in parallel. I'd filed the request for removal with the lender 6 weeks before the hearing. The commercial loan on Craig's equipment flipping venture, the one I'd co-signed 2 years earlier for $42,000, had a remaining balance of $28,000. With my name off it, Craig's income and credit history weren't sufficient to hold it on their own. The lender sent him a registered letter requesting resolution within 30 days. He couldn't refinance independently. His assets were limited. The kitchen equipment he'd been accumulating in a rented storage unit near Garson was repossessed over the course of 2 days in early April. Pauline told me about it gently, the way you tell someone about a consequence they knew was coming and still didn't fully prepare for. She asked if I was all right. I was. I'd measured this possibility when I made the call. Every structure has a load limit. This one had been past it for a long time. Craig and Kieran vacated on day 28. The property management company I'd hired for the transition did the walkthrough that afternoon. It wasn't good. A section of baseboard in the front bedroom pulled away from the wall, looked like it had been kicked. A deep gouge in the hallway floor that was too long and too deliberate to be accidental. The door to the garage was hanging slightly off its upper hinge. Small things, but not accidental things. The repair quote came in at just under $8,000. I filed a claim with the board and noted it in the record. The sale closed in early May. The family from Timmins took possession on a Friday. I drove past the house that evening without planning to. The lights were on in the kitchen and the living room. There was a bicycle on the front porch that hadn't been there before. I drove past slowly and then kept going. The net from the sale, after all costs, came to $411,000. I bought a smaller place on the outskirts of Chelmsford, west of the city, where Elise and I had always talked about retiring. Quieter, more land, a proper garage workshop with enough space to finally build the furniture pieces I'd been sketching for years. 2 bedrooms, a back deck facing the tree line, room to think. The first thing I hung in the workshop before I unpacked a single box was Elise's canning jar. The one I'd found in the recycling bag by the back door. I'd washed it and kept it on the shelf in the Donovan apartment all winter. I hung it on a nail above the window where the morning light hits it first. 6 weeks after I moved in, Kieran called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered. He was quieter than he'd been in years. Some of the hard edge that had been in his voice since the hearing was gone. Dad. It's me, I know, I said. We're in a place in the new Sudbury area. It's okay. Small, but it's ours. A pause. Craig and we're figuring some things out. I waited. I've gotten very good at waiting. I've been thinking about the night Craig sent that text, he said. I knew that night that it was wrong. I didn't say so. Not to you, not to him. His breath caught slightly. I've been trying to figure out why I didn't. My counselor says I've got some things to work out around that. Another pause. Anyway, I'm not calling to ask for anything. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For not picking up the phone that night, for not saying it sooner. I should have. I held the phone for a moment. Outside the workshop window, the tree line was doing what Ontario tree lines do in early June, filling in slowly, green coming back after a long gray winter. "Thank you," I said. "That matters." "Are you okay?" he asked. "Are you happy?" I looked around the workshop. Pauline was coming for dinner. The workbench was cleared and ready for the first real project. Through the window, the oaks were full and bright. "Yes," I said. For the first time in a while, genuinely yes. The quiet that followed wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the quiet of two people sitting with something true. "I'm glad," he said. And I believed him. We didn't make plans. We didn't promise weekly calls. I told him he had this number and he could use it when he was ready. He said okay. We hung up. I stood in the workshop for a long time after. The morning light came through the east window the way it always does in June at this latitude. Long and low and honest. I thought about what the last 2 years had actually cost me, and what they'd given back. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I've had enough quiet evenings on this back deck to think it through properly. The thing I got most wrong, for most of those 26 months, was what I told myself patience was. I convinced myself that absorbing the small disrespects without comment was a form of love. That because Kieran was my son and I would do anything for him, anything included watching a man rearrange my home and call it his, that endurance was generosity. It isn't. And I think that's the thing that most people who've been in a similar place know in the back of their minds but can't quite say out loud yet. Patience is not the same thing as erasure. Loving someone is not the same thing as giving them permission to treat you as though you don't matter. I am a precise man. I measure things. And the most precise thing I can tell you about what happened over those 2 years is this. There is a version of love that asks you to stay present and available and honest. And there is a version that asks you to keep quiet and get smaller. Only one of those is actually love. The other one is fear wearing love's clothes, and it is very good at the disguise. If any part of this felt like looking in a mirror, I want to ask you to do just one thing. Find the thing you've been calling patience. Give it its real name, even if only to yourself. Even just for a moment. Because naming it clearly is where everything else starts. Tell me in the comments, do you think I handled this the right way? Leave a 1 if you think I did. Leave a 2 if you think I went too far. Leave a 3 if you think I should have acted sooner. And tell me where in Canada you're watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. It means something to me to know how many of us are out there, sitting with the same questions in different rooms. If this story stayed with you, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. I'm going to keep telling these ones. The quiet stories about dignity, and what it takes to get it back when it's been slowly taken from you. I'll have another one ready soon. Stick around.